David Kahn and I met years ago when he was going to produce the band I was in, and we were going to get a record deal and be huge rock stars, right? None of that happened, but our relationship started and it continued, and David started using me on records he was producing up in New York City. And so I'd fly up there, a couple times a year, sometimes more, sometimes less, just depending, to play on records. And it was always super fun going to work for him. So I was up there playing on a record that he was producing, and for years, all the years I knew him, he had worked with Paul. He had produced records on Paul. He had mixed like live records for Paul. Every time that I was around David, there was some form of interaction that he had with him. Like whether it was like Paul calling him on a cell phone, or like I remember one time we were working on somebody's record at the old power station, which is Avatar now, which is where David had a suite for decades, where he was like finishing mixes for when Paul went back to the Budokan and recorded like a live DVD pack, whatever it was, and like Paul had to come and watch it and approve it like the next day or something. So it's like there's all these times where, of course, I'm thinking like, am I gonna haphazardly meet the guy, right?
Yeah.
And it never happened. Like came so close so many times, and it never happened. And so I kind of put it out of my brain, and I was up there. This is in like 2018, I think, and I was up there playing on a record, usual, did, a couple days of tracking, doing this, doing that. And then I had one more day where I was going to come back and do a bunch of overdubs, and then a car was going to take me to the airport, and I'd fly home. And so I come in, and David's a night owl, so we work really late hours, and then like start in the mid-afternoon, usually, with David. So I'm in, it's, 1 or 2 in the afternoon, I'm drinking my coffee, and he comes in and he goes, "Hey, I think Paul's going to come by today." And I'm, what? I mean, it's just completely off, unexpected. And like I said, I'd put this out of my head, like, because it had been, like I'd been beat down by the life saying, no, it's not going to happen, And just out of the blue, I think Paul's going to come by. And I'm like, what? He's like, yeah, he's in town. He's alone. His wife is like, I think his wife was like in Boston with friends or something. So like Paul was in New York City alone, and like David is one of his friends. So like he's going to come by, and they were going to like go to dinner or something. He goes, okay. He's like, let's get all the heavy lifting stuff done. And there was like one track he wanted me to like do a bunch of slide and do a bunch of fancy stuff that I can do and often do. And he was like, he's like, I want him to see you play. And I'm like, what are you doing? I'm like, okay. Like, on one hand, it's like, thank you, right? Because it's like, what an incredible gift, And then the other part is like, what is happening? And so we quickly do the busy work we need to get done. And sure enough, like right at when he said he would, like his phone rings and he's, and I hear, and I've heard it like this far from, I've heard the voice like on his cell phone this close, but it's like, hey man, and it's like, oh, hey man, I'm here, I'm pulling up, man, and I'm just like, holy shit, this is happening. And David is like, all right, I'm gonna go get him and bring him up, and I'm just like, and I'm a pretty, I can keep my shit together pretty well.
You've been around a lot of famous people.
Yeah, but I mean, like, but this is so another, and so there he comes out of the elevator with David. There he is. He's incredibly gracious, and he's like, "Hi, I'm Paul," and I'm like, yeah, you are. No, but, and David introduced us, and David's like, yeah, that I told you about, he's from Nashville, and blah, blah, blah. And the thing that I remember most about the interaction with him, because it continues and there's more to the story, which I'll tell here, but his level of looking at the surroundings and like looking me up and down, and like his level of awareness was unlike anything that I've ever experienced. And it continued because I was around him for a couple hours, and it was just David, me, and him. It was just the three of us in this control room at this studio in New York, and David's new room that he has that's more downtown. He moved out of Avatar and he moved into this other studio that's on the Lower East Side. But yeah, I was really taken with that, because I'd never experienced someone who was, because it wasn't like the vibe wasn't so much like, who are you? It was more so like, I am constantly collecting data, is what it seemed like. Yeah. And I've just never seen that kind of, and I guess it has to come from just a lifetime of ultra awareness, I guess, like I'm sure it's probably a self-defense. Like it's one thing that if like I actually got to be around him regularly, it's something I would like actually want to inquisitively answer just out of curiosity, but nonetheless, so we go into the control room and he sits down. He's like, man, I love being at sessions, and he's like, I love, and I'm still just kind of like amazed at the environment that I'm in with him. And David says, yeah, we still have a track that we have to finish, if you don't mind. He's like, yeah, man, absolutely. Do your thing, man. And so I do it, and it's the best I felt in the entire thing was like actually when I was playing music, because like I felt safe in the music. It was the not say the wrong thing, not like trying really hard to contain it all was hard. But like once it was like, oh, I'm playing music. I know how to do this. I don't know how to do this, but I know how to do that, and or think I do. So I did the track and did whatever I did, and Paul was like, hey, David, I've got, he's like, do you mind? And David was like, what are you going to say? It's Paul McCartney, right? And so Paul comes up to me and he's like, JD, man, like, go back. He's like, I'm hearing a part. And he like hummed a line to me. And it was a great line. I mean, like, it was, it was like, absolutely. And he was like, yeah, they should go. He's like, bro, and so then I have Paul directing me what to play on this thing, which was insane. And then
go figure, Paul McCartney had a great idea for a melody.
Yeah, exactly. It was just absolutely. After that, he had this little it's like the size of your fingernail or something, like a harmonica that I guess is like one of his toys. And like, so we finished, and like he, like a goofball, like pulled it out and went, and just like completely disarmed any tension. And I'm sure he was just like, it's something he does to like just be silly, so that happened, and it was funny, and we laughed. And then there's David is a magnificent musician himself and a great piano player, and so his rig was right there, and so of course Paul goes over to it and hits it, and David unmutes everything, so that it makes sound when Paul, because he sees Paul's going for it. And he played, it was something, he played like some, Jerry Lee Lewis thing or whatever, which I played with him. It was spur of the moment, just very much sort of having watched like the Get Back thing on Disney now and stuff. It's just like, that's, how he is, he's just, it's all fun and screwing around. And so we get done, he plays that, I'm playing with him and all that. And he gets done and woo, and he's like, and he reaches out and he goes, shake my hand, and he goes, I guess we're in a band now. And I'm like, what the fuck? Like, what is happening? You know, and we just sat, because the work was done, and I had a car coming to get me, to take me to the airport. And we just sat for, you know, like well over an hour and a half, just the three of us just shooting the shit. And we talked about all kinds of stuff. I let them steer the conversation, obviously, like I knew well enough to do that. But there were a couple other side notes to wrap up the long version of my Paul story. Is occasionally I would start to get somewhat comfortable, like finally start to like sort of ease into it, like, okay, we're just hanging out, we're talking, he's a guy, I'm a guy. And then he would say something that would just completely hit reset on that for me. Like, but one, like I have my old 335 that I've had for years, that I had with me, and it was like laying right there. And at one point he was like, yeah, it's just like one of John had, you know. And I'm like, so it's like, all right, hit reset, you know. And then there was another moment where he was disparagingly talking about a very popular artist that he thought was very he had had interactions with right before this, and he was knocking their lack of experience, okay, at the level that they're at. And he referenced Hamburg, which again is like, okay, hit reset. But then it entered into this really fascinating, the best part of the conversation that I remember very, very clearly is that transferred into him talking in depth about Hamburg, and David talking about his lounge days in San Francisco before he became this huge producer. And then David to include me. Again, like this all comes down to like David making sure this happened, made it so I played in front of, like, I mean, what a amazing gift. Like, I mean, and I didn't overthink it at the time. I overthought it a lot afterward, where I was like, was this an audition of some sort? Was this like, what was the purpose for this? And I've since gone on to work, like last summer we worked on James, his son James's record, which Paul was involved in. So I mean, but that's you know the extent of it. But nonetheless, David pulling me into their conversation, like mentioned my days of playing with the Don Kelly band here, and that's how David became aware of me initially, was seeing YouTubes of me playing with Don and Dave Rowe, and so that like kind of brought me into the conversation, and I just couldn't help myself. I had to ask a handful of questions, which I knew was, from everything David had ever told me, he was like, you let him lead. Like, you don't ask the question, you let him offer something, because the wall can go up immediately. And I just couldn't help myself, you know. And so I asked him, the first thing I asked him is, I was like, well, how long did you guys actually play? Like set length-wise, like in Hamburg, because I'm curious, right? And he said, well, he's like we play from like 6 to 7 till like 2 or 3 in the morning, but if there were people there, I love it them doing the voice, right? I shouldn't do the voice. But if there were people in the place, we'd keep playing. And he's like, and there were times where we played basically until sunup if the place was full of people. And so I'm thinking, that's a crazy amount of time to play. And which led me to, well, what would it be? Like, would you like play for an hour and then half-hour break? And he's like, no, like 45 minutes on, 15 off kind of. And I was like, okay, that makes sense. And then I was like, how many songs did you, like, how did you fill that? And he's like, well, we repeated a lot. And he's like, but he elaborated in that, well, when we first went there, he's like, we didn't even have one set really. And so we just played it over and over. And then he said, we learned really quick that we had to amass a lot of songs quickly. And he's like, of course, that's, you know, initially what really spurred us to write was because we needed material. But he's like, we did everything we could to go see other acts, and it's like, okay, we'll pinch that song, and hanging out with their friends. He talked about, you know, Astrid and Klaus, you know, saying like, we became friendly. We had our group of friends that would turn us on to records and stuff. And he's like, we finally got to where we had, like, I think he said four really solid sets of music. And he said, you know, we had like a great beginning, great middle, great ending of 4 sets, or 3 or 4. I think it was 4. And he said, and then we'd go back home and we'd only have to play 1 hour. And he's like, so we took the best parts of all 4 sets and made one crazy good one. And he said, we knocked their dicks in the dirt. And I was just like, oh my God. So we, you know, talked about a bunch of other stuff, and then the car came and it was time for me to go, and it was probably a good thing. I will say, I think at one point I attempted to ask another question, and Paul was like, you are to me, and then like David was behind him, and like David gave me a look like, don't, like, stop.
Yeah.
And I backpedaled out of it somehow, and I left, and they called me drunk a couple hours later, or David called me with Paul a couple hours later.
They were somewhere drunk.
And it was hilarious to hear that message. And then, yeah, I mean, I talked to, you know, David and I have not talked about it a ton since, but he definitely like confirmed. He was like, you got lucky. He's like, he doesn't always talk like that. He's like, that was a really good chance for you in that. And yeah, I mean, and what a story for the grandkids someday.